Introduce our speaker today, Lauren Van Ewyk. She's a registered social worker. She's a foster mom, and she is a mental health advocate. She works with businesses and with farm families across Canada and focuses on mental health specifically in the agricultural sector. Lauren is with us today on behalf of an organization called Do More Agricultural Foundation. Do More Ag is a Canadian not-for-profit organization which is focused on education, specifically in the agricultural industry about mental health. And so it's my pleasure today to welcome Lauren. How are you?
Hey, Kevin, thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute privilege to be here to chat with you folks all across Canada. So absolutely, I'm fantastic and I'm glad to be here with you.
Well, you know, it's nice to connect with you as well, and we're looking forward to hearing your insights. I guess because, you know, COVID, I think has brought this particular topic to the forefront more than anything, but it's sort of ironic. I think it's ironic. Is that the right word? That this topic tends to be one of those out of sight, out of mind topics, right? When my physical health is messed up, I can look at it and I can see that I'm overweight or whatever the physical, but with mental health, it's just, as long as there's not a problem, we just keep going. So anyway, I won't take up your time. This is your time. And so the virtual platform is all yours.
Well, it's a thrill to chat with you. It's true, though. One of the things we know about farmers is we go for a long period of time under stress, and we function well for a long period of time under that stress. And then there's a quick flip sometimes. And so that's part of what cultivating strength is all about. That's part of what this conversation is today. Now, before we kind of get into the presentation, real quick, I do want to say thank you to FCC. Amazing, awesome. Do More Ag loves partnering with FCC. But I also want to chat real quick about your sharing. Today, I'm hoping that you'll share. I'm hoping that you'll enjoy the conversation and it will be so engaging for you that you kind of go out from this presentation, you've got a few tools that you can use. Just do so in a way that you feel comfortable. Certainly, we want to make sure that you don't feel vulnerable at the end. So that is one thing that we always chat about from Do More Ag's perspective, is just about that piece, right? Okay, so what is mental health? Mental health includes our emotional, our psychological, and our social well-being. Now, a lot of times when we hear mental wellness or we hear mental health, we think illness, right? We tend to think, oh, well, that person has anxiety or that person is bipolar, but that's not actually mental health at all. I mean, mental health is our ability to engage with other people. It's our ability to read other people's perspectives and their facial impressions and expressions. And so understanding that mental health includes our emotional, our psychological, and our social. It's much broader than what we traditionally tend to think. So real quick, kind of what's happening right now. We always want to chat real briefly about what is causing us some stress. This is a pretty short list compared to some of the things that might be causing you stress. But for one, COVID, right? You know, still trying to navigate those waters across the country. We see very different regulations, that sort of thing, production concerns, consumer demand. Certainly weather is beyond our control, but it causes us a great deal of stress. We know that this year, you know, in our Western provinces, there was some significant droughts. We lived in Manitoba. We've got family in Alberta. And so certainly, you know, the weather was very difficult for some of our fellow farmers across the country, as is every year. There's different pockets that struggle with that. Debt, you know, margins are thin. Things can go from good to bad very quickly in farming in Canada. Cash flow, we've had some canceled contracts, especially when COVID first happened. Now, this statistic here about farm debt is obviously from 2015, because if you speak to a lender now, they will tell you it's much closer to $1 million per farm. And so debt is really a piece of the puzzle that is also causing our farmers stress. So those are a few. If you want to pop up in the chat box there, let me know what are some things that you would identify as causing you stress now. I want to chat with you about the current picture. A lot of times as farmers, we don't always see, or when we do see it, we don't always acknowledge. But folks, 35% of farmers meet the classification for depression. This is actually a study that was done by the University of Guelph. I believe it was in 2016. Now, when I say meet the classification, that's not just somebody who wakes up one morning and says, oh, you know what, I'm feeling kind of sad today. No, no, no. In order to meet the classification, there's a number of criteria that someone would have to kind of check the box on. And so have a look at those stats. 35% meet the classification of depression, 58%, that's nearly 3 in 5 farmers meet the classification for anxiety. That's a huge number. 45% report high stress. Again, 68% are more susceptible to chronic stress than the general population. Now, the importance of chronic stress is understanding how that influences our life. Chronic stress produces a chemical or hormone in our body called cortisol. It's best known as like the stress hormone. It kind of builds up in our body if we don't get rid of it or we don't do things to kind of address it. And what, like I said, what we see in farmers is that chronic stress over a long period of time, and then it leads to feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. So 68% are more susceptible to chronic stress than the general population. So family relationships regarding stress, absolutely, absolutely. Now there's also 20 to 30% higher suicide rates than any other occupation in Canada among farmers. Again, those are some scary statistics, right? And yet some reality, absolutely reality for the farmers. So providing support, how do we recognize when someone is in need of support? I want to give you a few kind of helpful tips here. Just give me 1 second here. I'm having some, there we go. Okay. All right. So signs to look for: emotional changes. We see poor emotional regulation, impulsiveness with reduced problem-solving ability. Now, when I think about poor emotional regulation, it takes me back to a time when I was in a grocery store and this lady was looking for something and she couldn't find it. And really quickly, literally in the blink of an eye, she took her hand out and she just kind of ran down the aisle and all sorts of food went crashing to the floor. And then she fell on the floor and was crying. I mean, there was really, she just couldn't contain those emotions any longer. There was obviously a lot more going on. But that would be something that we look for. A great difficulty making a decision, normally a decision that we would not have any difficulty making, right? So what should I have for lunch today? Or I've had it where some farmers are like, you know what, I just couldn't figure out how to get to that farm. You know, I always go left, right, left, but that day I couldn't even formulate the thoughts of how to get to my farm. Low moods or extreme opposite. And the other thing is when family members or care providers would report that their loved one's personality has entirely changed. So that person is normally a very generous person, and suddenly that significantly changes. So those are emotional changes that you would look for. Now, behavioral changes look a little bit different. Oftentimes there's a withdrawal from activities that they used to enjoy. So no longer wanting to do any, go to church or go to a recreational hockey team or coffee row, that type of thing. Changes in sleep patterns, changes in appetite, changes in socialization. So people who used to not have any difficulty talking on the phone are suddenly like, oh, I don't even want to talk on the phone anymore, right? Evidence of self-harm. Those would be the behavioral changes that we would look for. That would indicate somebody is in need of some support. Okay, other signs to look for. They express that they're not doing well emotionally, right? When somebody is able to say to somebody else, you know what, I am just feeling emotionally drained and like my emotions are just all over the place. Okay, that would be an indication. Also, if they talk about their worries that are constant or their fears, or fears that they're experiencing, that's just a constant draw on their emotional stability. A third consideration is when somebody indicates there's no reason to live or that the world would be better off without them. right? That's suicidal ideation, perhaps, that they're starting to communicate. That also would be a sign to look for. Okay, so let's jump into it. What does support really look like? First of all, active listening. If you think about when your child or your sibling or somebody comes home from an event and you say to them, did you have a good time? Their typical answer is yes or no, right? How many times have you gone to a social function and you say, oh, how are you today? And they say, fine. Kind of a one-word answer. Those are considered close-ended questions. Open-ended means you can't just answer it with yes or no. So instead of did you have a good day, say something to the effect of, tell me about your day, right? Help me understand what was happening at work. Or what do you think of that new boss? Is that working out, right? Or tell me about how that's working out. Okay, that's active listening. We want to grow that conversation. If you're thinking about a friend or a coworker or a family member, and they clearly are anxious or sad, you can use this skill. And it might seem like a really elementary skill, but folks, it's what opens that door to conversation. It's a really important part of just opening that door and allowing some conversation to flow. So some of the things you could say, if you think about it, is what is the this, right? What is he really saying here? What is the this? I just can't do this anymore. Tell me about the this, John. Hey, John, tell me about, right? Absolutely, open the conversation. One thing to keep in mind is it's really important to give an individual space and room to take their time to have that conversation. One of the things we know is the linguistic center of the brain is among the last to be developed. So if you think about a young child, what do they learn to do first? Do they learn to drink a bottle or communicate with you how they're feeling in words, structured, all sentence and pretty together, right? Absolutely no. They learn to take a bottle first. Do they learn to run or walk, or do they learn to communicate how they're feeling? Absolutely. I see some really great stuff in the chat box there. Wonderful input, right? Giving somebody space and room to talk is really critical because sometimes that linguistic center of the brain is affected, especially if a person experiences some trauma before they have verbal ability. So absolutely, take a deep breath, sit back, allow them to take some time and some space to have that conversation. Okay, clarification. Folks, this is, in my opinion, the second most important skill you could have. I mean, as far as relationships, if there's anybody in your life that you're in a relationship with and that you value that relationship, this is the second most important skill. Okay, clarification. Now, when you clarify, you restate something, you use different words, but it's like a summary. Now, it serves two functions. Sometimes we think clarification is for us, right? So I understood what you said, but clarification is actually for the other person who's doing the speaking. You see, if John said to me, oh, I'm feeling really overwhelmed, and I said, oh, John, I think I'm hearing you feel you're really tired. He might say, no, I'm not tired at all. I just have too much expectations at work, right? So it gives him a chance to hear, or the other person talking, to listen to what I think I understood. It allows them to also clarify what they're thinking or feeling. Okay, so here's another example. Oh, man, I'm done. I have no energy left. This farm is exhausting, and no matter how hard I work, there's always more waiting for me. If you were to clarify that for John, what do you think it would sound like? Like, really, what are we hearing John say? I think some of the things you want to touch on there is that he's saying he has no energy left, right? He's exhausted. It feels like there's a never-ending list of things to be done. Folks, that's clarification. Really important. All right. In my opinion, this is the most important skill you can learn in communication and an important relationship: validation. Now, validation doesn't mean that I just come into an agreement with whatever you say, whatever opinion you have. No, that's not validation. Validation means that we come into an agreement of sorts. with with somebody else's perspective. It's personal. It's their personal experience seen as truthful. I'm going to give you a little example. It's a little bit off the wall, but if I was chatting with Sandra and Sandra said, oh, Loren, look at the sky. It's a big, beautiful blue sky. And I looked up at the sky and I thought, oh, Sandra's nuts. It's red. I have two options. I can say, Sandra, are you crazy? That's not a red sky. That's definitely, or sorry, that's not a blue sky. It's definitely a red sky. I could do that. And I want to ask you real quick, how do you think Sandra would respond if I did? Or I could say, wow, Sandra, look at that sky. It's immense. Look at all that color, right? Look at those clouds. I can come into a form of agreement with her, even if we don't agree on that piece about the color. I can come into a form of agreement. You see, it's validation. We're often all actually looking for validation. So in this situation with John, in this case study, I can say, you know what, you're right. Farming is tough. Even though we work hard, there's always something around the corner that needs us to attend to. How do you think John feels when I say that to him? Does he feel dismissed? Or does he feel like he's been heard? Because that's what validation does. In all relationships, it says that your opinion is valuable and it's important to me. So folks, when somebody needs that validation, and we all need it, let's find ways to offer it. One of the things we're going to chat about today is empathy.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Empathy versus sympathy. Now, that's not to say that sympathy is always wrong, right? It's not to say that a sympathetic response is always wrong. But we often do not go to the empathetic, where we're joining in with people and we're building relationship, which is absolutely critical when it comes to mental health. Now, understand that farmers, we are fixers by nature, right? For the most part, as farmers, we are fixers by nature. We're presented with a problem, our equipment has broken down. We take whatever steps it takes to fix it. We are fixers by nature. And folks, there are times when we just can't fix something, where we need to join in instead. Okay, so wow, that must be really tough. Okay, would you say that's a sympathetic response or an empathetic? Wow, must be really tough. Right? Yeah, absolutely. Empathetic, for sure. What about, I don't really know what to say, but can I sit with you? Would you say that's sympathetic or empathetic? Absolutely, empathetic. Good job. Okay, next one. How about I do your chores for you to lighten your load? Ooh. Now, would that be wrong? I mean, most farmers would say, hey, that sounds good to me. Come and help me do some chores to lighten my load. That's not a wrong answer. I mean, if you're a working mom and you've got 5 kids and somebody's down sick and your husband or your partner is away from the farm and you got to do chores and somebody came along and said, hey, can I help lighten your load by doing some chores? We might just kiss the ground they walk on a little bit, right? It's not a bad answer, but it's important that we understand the difference between an empathetic response and a sympathetic response. So how about I do your chores for you to lighten your load? We're trying to fix something. That's a sympathetic response. I'm so sorry that you have to experience this. Sympathetic or empathetic? Are you trying to fix something or are you joining in? Absolutely, empathetic response. Good job. What about, well, at least you didn't lose all your livestock. Folks, this is actually based on a true story. A good friend of mine had 2 barns, and 4 days after she moved to the farm, one of her barns burned down and she lost a number of animals in it. And people, I believe they had the best of intentions. They said things like, well, at least you didn't lose all your livestock, right? That's a sympathetic response. We're trying to put roses and Skittles and sunshine on a very painful situation. That's a sympathetic response. Okay, what about, I'll call your pastor to come and help you. Sympathetic or empathetic? Absolutely. Absolutely sympathetic. Why? What are we doing? We're trying to fix it, right? Let me tidy this all up. I'm going to call somebody else to come and help you. Okay, what about call me if you need me? Sympathetic or empathetic? I know we do it all the time. In fact, I've caught myself doing it sometimes, right? For sure. It is sympathetic because we're, again, trying to fix something. We're fixing it by putting the responsibility back on the person. I had a great phone call not very long ago with a good friend. And then a couple of days later, she called me again. She had been diagnosed with breast cancer. And I caught myself in that moment saying, listen, call me if you need me. And instead of saying that, I thought, wait a minute, let's do this differently. And I said, hey, you know what? I'm going to pop over in a couple of days. I'm going to bring you some supper. You don't have to entertain me. I can just drop it at the door. If you're not up for any kind of a visit, that's okay. But I'm going to check in with you. You can have a bit of a plan to check in. Okay, what about, this is a lot for anyone to juggle. It must feel overwhelming at times. Resilience. Now, resilience isn't just mental toughness. It's actually learning specific strategies and skills to be able to bounce back. That's what resilience is. If you were to picture for just a minute, sometime when you've rolled your lawn, if you've ever rolled your lawn, you'll notice that this great big drum, a steel drum usually, sometimes there's water inside a plastic barrel. In the spring or in the fall, usually the spring, I think, we roll the grass. And that grass actually gets pressed down. But in due time, it raises back up. And folks, that's resilience. It's an ability to recover from difficulties. It's an ability to say to yourself, you know what, I've done hard things before, I can do hard things again. Now, again, as farmers, we seem to be somewhat naturally resilient in many ways, right? When our crop has not turned out, but the following year we plant again. That's resilience. When our animals are not producing the way that we had hoped and we continue to refine our practices, that's resilience. We get knocked down at times, but we get back up. That's resilience. However, it's actually like a muscle you can grow. It's something that we can learn and develop. And it's important because remember how I talked about chronic stress, right? That cortisol buildup? It's resilience that helps to lower some of that cortisol. So one of the things we need to do is to change the narrative, to limit rumination. Now, we raise sheep. We have a sheep farm down in southwestern Ontario. And I can tell you a little bit about sheep, and it might not be the most pleasant of conversations, but I think I'm with some friends here online who would kind of nod and smile and understand. Okay, so sheep have 4 stomachs. So they eat something and it goes down to the first stomach. Then they bring it back up. Go over it a little bit more, it goes down to the second stomach, comes back up, goes over it a little more to the third and fourth stomach. We need to learn to change the narrative, to limit that rumination. Because sometimes we get sticky thoughts. They get stuck in our head. Oh, what does so-and-so think about my farming practices, right? Or, oh my goodness, my crop's gonna fail and this is gonna happen, this is gonna happen, it's gonna be terrible. I need to just drop my keys off, that kind of thing. No. Let's change that narrative. Let's reframe it. Let's think about this from a different perspective. It's a really important strategy for growing resilience. Now, another thing we need to do is practice self-compassion. Can I just be so bold as to say that in our culture, we don't do this very well? Right? We really don't do this well. The way to practice self-compassion is this: recognize that you're not actually alone in it. You're not the only one to experience this difficulty. Now, that might seem harsh. I understand why. And yet it's a bit of a reality, right? We face hard things. The other thing to do to practice self-compassion is to understand that we need to treat ourselves with as much care and compassion that we would treat a neighbor or a friend. So if at work or on the farm, if you have a new worker that makes a mistake and you're able to say, you know what, you're a new worker, you're learning, that's okay. But when you make a mistake, you hold yourself to this really high expectation that you should never, ever make a mistake. That's an area where you can practice some self-compassion. There's an old proverb, and I don't remember it exactly. It goes something like, you know, a wise man continues to learn or continues to seek wisdom, something like that. So folks, I mean, that means that we are going to make mistakes. We do make mistakes. It means that to be wise means to have made mistakes and to learn along the way, along this journey of life. That's self-compassion. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay that we're still learning. It's okay that you're not perfect. Absolutely. Now, some of the other things that we want to do to build resilience is to learn deep breathing. We're going to get to that. Thought change activities. We're going to try and get to that. And then prayer meditation. I know some people, think about your family lineage. What are some things that your grandparents held dear to you, a quality that you appreciated about them, that you still hold dear yourself, that legacy piece? And then to practice forgiveness, particularly that towards yourself. Absolutely, right? When we make mistakes, let's practice some self-compassion. Okay, I'm going to teach you box breathing. So now some of you, if you've done yoga or some other kind of breathing techniques, you might have learned something called belly breathing. If that's the way you've learned to do deep breathing, that's great. You go ahead and do it. But if you haven't learned or tried deep breathing in a while, I'm going to really challenge you here. We're going to step outside the comfort zone just a little bit and learn now. So if you can get your feet kind of planted firmly on the floor, a lot of times this is what happens. I tell people, okay, we're going to take some deep breaths, and they go, and they get right stiff. Okay, we're not going to do that today. In fact, I'm going to get you to slouch just a little bit. If you've been riding a horse lately, you'll know that you do a bit of a pelvic tilt, right? You kind of sink into that saddle. Well, that's one of the things you're going to do. The other thing you're going to do is take your shoulders up to your ears and then let them drop. Okay? Shoulders up to your ears, let them drop, and then tilt that pelvis so you're sinking into yourself. And what we're going to do is we're going to inhale through our nose for 4 seconds. And we're going to hold it for 4 seconds. And then we're going to exhale for 4 seconds. And then we're going to hold it for 4 seconds. Now, one of the things I teach people to do is to actually practice deep breathing 3 times in the morning when you wake up and 3 times before you go to bed. Because what happens is your brain actually kind of takes over, and in stressful situations, your brain will automatically do some of this deep breathing. How do we make sure we're taking care of ourselves? Now, sometimes when I chat with farmers and they hear about the word self-care, they think, oh, that's self-indulgent or selfish or self-absorbed. It's none of those things. In fact, self-care actually means that you're choosing to take care of yourself so you can choose to take care of others. How many of you have ever ridden on an airplane, and what do they say about that mask? Right? Do they say, okay, put it on everybody around you and sacrifice yourself? No, they don't do that. They say, put it on yourself before you help other people. And the reason is because you're more effective helping other people if you've got your own mask on. The same holds true for self-care. When we learn to participate in self-care, we're actually preserving our own health and we're protecting our well-being. It's a responsible and purposeful manner in which to live. So it can look different. Now, a lot of times when I talk to people, they'll say something to the effect of like, oh, self-care, it means I'm going to take a pedicure, you know. Or for farmers, they often get told, oh, you need to go on vacation, which is really not possible many times. So understand that self-care actually looks very different than just a pedicure or going on vacation. I mean, that could be part of it. But self-care encompasses 6 different areas: your psychological, your emotional, your physical, your career, your spiritual. And so when you choose to try a different recipe, or when you spend some time being grateful in the morning, listing 5 things that you're grateful for that happened the day before, that is part of self-care. For some people, it's time with other people. That is one of the ways to deal with cortisol, is spending time with friends and family. For other people, it's time away. It's having some quiet time. So understand that self-care can look different. I mean, in fact, if you were to go outside and take a look at a leaf and notice its shape, just as this gentleman, he's checking out his crop there, right? Notice the shape, notice the texture, notice the color. Okay, that's all mindfulness. It's a way to provide yourself with some self-care before you jump in to the craziness of the day, to just appreciate all that you pour your heart and soul into. Yep, music, going to yoga, going for a walk, absolutely. Taking a walk to the top of the bin and breathing, awesome, absolutely. Turning off your phone, thank you, for sure. That's another great strategy. Photography, great. So for livestock people, I just say, hey, take a few minutes and really absorb those animals. Watch them frolicking. With our lambs, they do these lamb races. And there's times where my husband and I will just sit and watch them run back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. That's self-care. Now, I also want to kind of chat about the barriers to accessing help. Because honestly and truly for farmers, we have some barriers, right? There's a lack of resources in some of our small towns. In fact, there's a really neat statistic. It talks about the number of psychologists in urban areas versus rural areas. In urban areas, there's 1 psychologist for every 23,000 plus people. But in rural areas, there's 1 psychologist for every 3,000 plus people. It's a significant change between the urban and the rural population. So we have a lack of resources. Small town talk, you know, everybody knows everyone. It's a reason why some people find that a barrier to accessing help. A lot of times, for whatever reason, within our brains as farmers, we think asking for help is failure when it comes to our mental health. Now, oftentimes, we're not afraid to ask a neighbor to help us fix a planter. We're not afraid to ask a neighbor to help us figure out our drainage problem. But when we're struggling with our emotions, we're feeling anxious, we have a lot of trouble bringing ourselves to the point where we can ask for help. Asking for help does not equate to failure. I'm conscious of the time. I want to make sure I get to some questions and I give you some time for questions. But understanding this, when we talk about stigma, that word actually originates in ancient Greece, where they would brand their slaves, right? They would say, oh, that slave belonged to me. We do this in our animals all the time. Our sheep get a livestock tag, and when they go to the auction and the RDIF picks it up, they know that that lamb was raised on our farm. Folks, we do this with our mental health all the time. No longer are you, Chris the coach, or Chris the one who likes to go to church, or the creative one, or Chris the one who is really meticulous about the shape of his farm, or Chris the one who enjoys going for walks in the woods, or the person who loves to try different foods. We then subject all of those attributes and replace it with this kind of umbrella of, oh, I'm Chris the depressed one, or I'm Chris the one who's been diagnosed with bipolar. And folks, that's where the stigma piece needs to change. Where we recognize that there is a lot more to us than a mental health diagnosis. That we don't lose out on all of those other attributes that we bring to the table because of a diagnosis. It's a piece of us for sure, but it doesn't tell the whole story. You can have optimum health and have a mental health diagnosis. Asking for help is not failure. Asking for help is actually a mature response to taking care of your farm, your family, your community. Sometimes people are unsure of where and when to turn for help. Certainly there's lots of resources out there. If you go to domore.ag, there's some great resources on that website. Lack of high-speed internet limits availability for virtual counseling, and the lack of agriculturally aware therapists is actually quite huge. There doesn't seem to be a lot of therapists like myself that really understand the ins and outs of agriculture. But that's changing. That's actually one of the goals of Do More Ag, is to change that as well. So when to speak to a professional, there's all sorts of reasons. A lot of times people think, oh, I need to talk to a mental health therapist when this is happening. But no, I work with people to do succession planning. I work with people who are having trouble with child rearing or spousal relationships, or they're experiencing anxiety, depression, or there's some historic experiences and trauma. And for farmers, that's actually a little bit more common than what we realize. There's a number of farmers who are also volunteer firefighters or exposed to trauma vicariously, or have a history of it themselves as children or young experiences. Those are all reasons to seek professional help. Now, I recommend a professional. I recommend that you find somebody who is board certified kind of thing, either a registered social worker or a registered psychotherapist, that type of thing. Understand that early intervention results in a faster recovery period. Hands down, absolutely. The earlier the intervention, the more successful your experience is. So as I mentioned, where to seek professional help, we've got domore.ag, local counseling centers. It's okay to speak to your doctor. Many rural practitioners, they are beginning to recognize the needs in the community, but I encourage you to not stop there. Find somebody that you can talk with, that they can help you kind of process how you're feeling, what you're thinking, and then learn some of these strategies. We only touched on a couple today, like the deep breathing one, to be able to seek out professional help and to be able to seek healing for the difficulty you're experiencing. So how to do more? We have the Talk, Ask, Listen program. We're working on the Ag Talk, the 24-hour support line, and Talk It Out has recently changed. We're still doing the Twitter ones, but not the Zoom meetings. And that is an evolving program. So stay tuned for that one. That brings us to the end of the actual presentation. But I definitely want to give you some time to ask some questions. And also, if you have a couple minutes, I'm happy to teach you a few more strategies for dealing with that stress that we talked about.
I think there are so many pieces to what you said resonated with me, but the one when we're talking about helping others is, and I only got it partially correct, but it was the idea that your response doesn't change anything. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Because I know as a speaker, and you would know as a speaker, that people need our presence more than they need our presentation. You know, it's not what we say, but it's about showing up. And I thought that was a pretty key point you made.
You know, I'm glad that you draw that out, because so often, even as parents, I find we fall into this category where we feel we have to say the right thing. But so often it really is about being present. I encourage people to just get curious, right? Remember how we talked about those open-ended questions? And so often, instead of actually solving a problem, let's get curious. Let's try and understand more rather than seek to fix things.
Yeah, and that's a hard thing. I know this is a sexist thing to say, but that is a hard thing for us guys to do, because that's what we want to do. That's just what we're good at, is fixing stuff.
Yeah.
And
yeah, it is. We do. And we like to jump into that role because it feels good for us. The problem is we don't want it to really be about us. We really want to be in tune to the other person. But yeah, great point. I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah. And I think for people, I suspect, and I'm only drawing not because I'm an expert, but just from the isolated examples that I have experienced in my life, that we as human beings, I think, are hesitant to reach out to help people because we don't know what to say. We want to have that magic bullet that makes all the difference. And I use the example in my head of years ago, about 11 years ago, my dad passed away. And when we go to a funeral, we're all, you know, people basically say, "Oh, I'm sorry for your loss." And it feels so lame. And yet when it happened to me when my dad passed, I don't remember anything anybody said. But I sure remember the people who showed up, the people who just gave a presence. And I just thought that's why that point to me was so powerful. And that's why I think we're hesitant to help, right? Because I don't know what to say, you know?
Do I have a minute just to share a quick story?
Yeah.
Okay. So my sister-in-law and my brother, their son passed away in 2014. So kind of similar to what you expressed. He was 4.5 years old. It completely caught everybody off guard. He had something called invasive group A strep pneumonia. It's basically the flesh-eating disease in your lungs. So there was no warning. I believe they were really well-intentioned people. I really believe there was well-intentioned people. But if you ask my sister-in-law and my brother who made the most impact, it wasn't anything anybody said. It was somebody who came and sat with her while she folded her laundry. There were people who said things like, "Well, at least your daughter didn't die too," or "at least you can have more children." But the people who really impacted her healing process, particularly in the very early onset, were people who literally sat and just wept with them. And that speaks to that joining in process, just as you spoke, right? We don't remember necessarily what people say, but it's that joining in process that really speaks volumes and helps with that healing process for sure.
Another of the questions that's come in is suggesting that, you know, men tend to be more resistant to seek help, which I suspect is probably true, but you may know better about that. But the question is, how can we support them to get help when they refuse without us overstepping?
It's a great question. I actually get faced with that a lot. So couple of things. I have to go back to kind of the first observation of, you know, men are more resistant to get help. Yes, that's true. However, it's important that men, if you're on this call and you're hearing this, statistically speaking, your partner is more at risk for mental health injury because you don't seek help. Women in partner relationships are much less likely to seek help because they are seen as their spouse's or partner's sole emotional support. And so they put off getting help themselves because their spouse doesn't get help. And so that's one of the things I just want to make sure, men, you understand, or maybe, you know, depending on the relationship, whatever's going on, that you getting help actually relieves the other person and allows them to get the help and support they also need. So that's kind of a caveat to it. But how do you do it in a way that doesn't create offense? Again, we come back to that joining in, right? So I have had spouses make appointments for their partner because the partner couldn't come to the place where they could reach out and make that. They can go to the appointment, but they couldn't make the appointment.
Yeah.
Right. And so you can say, okay, listen, in order for my own mental health to be okay, I need you to get some support as well. How can I help you do that? Right. So that's one of the pieces. Another piece is allowing for that kind of open dialogue and the getting curious part. Tell me, what is it that makes calling someone so hard? Like, what is it that makes calling Loren so hard? Help me understand. Right? Because does it mean that you're a failure? Because in my view, it makes you not a failure. It makes you a responsible partner, a responsible father and dad and husband, that kind of thing.
And I think it also, as you create awareness, and we've all had time to think of this, especially during COVID, because we've all had added stress with all the pieces of that. There becomes an awareness, at least that's my perception, is that the mind is really just like any other muscle in the body. So if I stress a muscle, like my bicep, and I do so many reps of so much weight and 3 reps of 12 or something like that, over a period of time, that creates strength. But if I stress a muscle endlessly for hours and days, it'll just fail. And I don't know if that's an accurate analogy, but I'm beginning to sense that we just assume that this and the heart, that it just is this endless, package of resilience that has no physical limits. And then suddenly, after all the negative news we consume, and our mental health has just been taking it on the chin. And I don't know, I just felt like we've become a little bit more aware that it's a piece of us that has limits. So why are we surprised that suddenly things aren't right or don't feel right?
I'm glad that you mentioned that. I'm glad that you mentioned that there's a growing awareness and an awareness to say, oh, maybe we're not as kind of bulletproof. Can I use that term, as we thought we were, so to speak? The reality is we do build up cortisol from stress, and stress might look a lot different now than it did before COVID, but it's still stress. And so there's really 4 effective ways to get rid of stress. So get rid of cortisol. Number 1 is exercise. I think that goes without saying. I think we all recognize, okay, exercise is good. Understanding that it doesn't always have to be like, okay, I'm going to the gym Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 6 a.m. to 7 a.m. It doesn't have to be that. When your buddy calls you up on a Saturday and says, hey, let's go for a hike, you say yes to those opportunities. That's part of that. Another one is an ugly cry. It's the second most effective way. I had a farmer call me one time and he said, oh, Loren, I don't know what to do. I just find myself crying. And I said, woo, that's amazing. That's wonderful, because this gentleman was under immense stress. And I'm talking about on the farm side, the financial side, the relationship side, the children's behavioral side, and the health side. There was stress pressing in on this gentleman from all sides. And yet part of the healthy way he was dealing with it was allowing himself to have an ugly cry. Now, I get it, men. That's not normally within your regime. It's okay to let that happen.
Okay, let's call it a scream then, or whatever makes a person feel better. Maybe if crying sounds too soft.
That's right. Yeah. And then eating carbohydrates, only half a cookie, not half a bag, and spending time with family and friends. That's what relieves cortisol.
Nice. Actually, you say that. I'm no expert. I just happened to read about 2 weeks ago from a credible source that cortisol is really connected with a lot of physical ailments, including heart disease, which of course is the #1 killer of the human race. So we're not kidding around here. This cortisol thing is obviously an important piece. Absolutely. So another question, and whoever, a hand clap to whoever came up to this question, because this is so human nature. And they're simply saying, how can we share this presentation with others without overstepping. And every one of us knows somebody. I have a colleague that every time you have a problem, they have a book to give you. Oh, you need to read this, you know? So how can we not be that person?
Yeah. You know, the beauty of this is because we're starting to talk about it more and more, people are actually less likely to get offended. But if they are that type, here's what you can do. Once FCC kind of publishes this, you can send that link and then you can kind of walk away. The problem happens when we try to force it too much, right? Like, did you watch that presentation? What did you think? Do you see this in your own life? When we start drilling somebody like that, we're going too far. Yeah. You can actually kind of leave it at their feet. You can always be curious. As I said, you can always say, hey, was it helpful? Right? I mean, if they share with you, yeah, I watched it, that was pretty good. Oh, I hope it was pretty good, but right? And you can say, hey, tell me what you thought about that, right? Yeah. Like you can open that conversation simply through curiosity and sharing the link. So I hope that answers the question. But one of the things is to not pressure it. You can actually just kind of leave it, let it ferment, let it grow, let it kind of do its thing. And not just with this presentation, but with even, you know, if ever you want to call a therapist, I'll be happy to make that phone call with you, right? Or here's the number, let me know if I can make it with you. And then leave it. Sometimes we tend to think people aren't capable, but really honestly and truly, we can take a step back and we can allow them that journey, that growth journey.
How do you know when to keep trying to help somebody and when to back off? They say, you know, they have a friend who is struggling, but tends to push away as soon as I try to help. And I imagine some of what you've already said about being empathetic rather than trying to fix it, I suppose, is part of that.
So that the answer to that question is actually twofold. And so there's that one portion where we offer services, allow it, whatever those services look like, allow it to grow, leave it at their feet kind of thing. So that's one of them, right? Where we say, hey, we're happy to call when you're ready. The other point is actually about creating boundaries. And I recognize this kind of goes against our way of thinking, but here's what we need to know about boundaries. I'm going to share a short story with you. I just love short stories. So one day I hear this knock on the door and this lady throws out her arm to me and says, and shows me this long red mark right down her arm. And I thought, ooh, I knew exactly right away what had happened. And I said to her, could you tell me why you tried to crawl through my electric fence? Because we have an electric fence around our property. And she said, well, I wanted to take pictures of the lambs in the front pasture. And I said, well, you know, I'm happy to take you out. Now that you've come and you've asked permission, I'm happy to take you out and allow you to take some pictures of those lambs in the front pasture. You see, the reality is boundaries, as much as we think they're for us, and they are, they're to keep things in, keep some things out. Boundaries are also for the people on the other side of the fence to get resourceful. And sometimes we only actually have so much to give. We tend to think, as you said, that we've got all of this to give, but we actually don't. We actually have a little bit less than what we think. Yeah. And so sometimes it actually requires you to set some boundaries and say, you know what, it means I can't have this 4-hour-long conversation with you because I can't do this right now. Right. And it forces them to become resourceful. And so that's that other piece of that puzzle.
Got it. That's really insightful. And the last piece, we need to wrap this up here, but maybe you can redirect to some resources on this. The question is, why, does your presentation, or why did this particular presentation not cover addiction? Is that a big piece of this? And where might people look for some insight on that?
That's a great question. And the interesting thing with addiction is we typically actually think of it as something we call a concurrent disorder, because addiction is actually a mental health issue, right? Like it's an unhealthful coping skill that's been developed and enhanced and engaged in and grows. And so we do cover addiction a little bit more thoroughly in our Talk, Ask, Listen presentation. We do talk about it a little bit more. And you know what? It might be a directive that Do More Ag does more in the future, because it certainly is an issue, but it wasn't one that was part of today's resilience building kind of platform or kind of discussion.
Well, your insights today certainly have helped us not only to be more aware, but really, quite frankly, just to be more open, just to be the real deal and reach out for support when we need it. Thanks so much for your insights, Lauren.
My pleasure. Nice to speak with everyone today.